I'm Libby Nelson. I'm an education reporter at Vox. I've been covering higher ed for a few years now. And on this panel, we're going to talk about predictive analytics, which you may know better as big data. And predictive analytics is used in all kinds of fields. It's basically looking at what you know about someone and what data points you have on them. And obviously, in this world, we have a lot of data points on a lot of people. And using that to predict what you think will happen in the future. So this is how Netflix predicts what you're going to want to watch. It's how Amazon predicts what you might want to buy. The best and creepiest example was from a New York Times Magazine article a couple of years ago on how Target figures out its shoppers are pregnant. And after sort of bouncing around first in the tech world and then in the retail world, and then trickling down sort of to the medical world, we're now seeing this predictive analytics, the science of big data, coming to higher education as well. And it's something that some people believe has a lot of promise for identifying students who are going to need help, for figuring out where the bottleneck courses are, the courses that if you fail them, you're likely to drop out or you're likely to have to change majors are for a given field of study, and a whole bunch of other applications that we're going to hear about. But it also has raised some concerns about the privacy of all of this data that's being collected. And on sort of a philosophical level, it's a little bit creepy that you can say the minute that the student enrolls or the minute they set foot on campus, we can look at these factors about them and we know whether they're likely to succeed or fail. So we're gonna dive into several ways that different campuses are using this, and then hopefully have some time for questions from all of you as well. But I would suspect that this is something that's happening at virtually every institution. One thing that really struck me when I set out to write about it, it's really rare to see a trend that is as promising or as popular or as embraced at community colleges, at for-profits, at small liberal arts colleges, at large flagship state universities, all of whom are handling it in different ways, have different ways of looking at the data, have different capacities for what they're able to do and not do. But the amount of interest was really across the board. And so that struck me as something that was really interesting and unusual and is not always something we see in covering trends like this. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed Venit to talk about the Education Advisory Board and what you're doing and the work that you're doing with these analytics.
Great. My name is Ed Venit. I'm a senior director with the Education Advisory Board. I've been there for 7 years now. And I'm guessing that, well, just by show of hands, how many know who EAB is? Have some interaction with us. Okay, not too many. We are the best kept secret in higher education. We're actually a division of the Advisory Board Company, which is primarily a healthcare research firm based in Washington, D.C., although now an increasing part of our business is devoted to serving college and university leaders. We actually work with 600 universities across North America of all different kinds, shapes and sizes, big, small, public, private, 4-year schools, 2-year schools, Canadian schools. But we largely work with, and by design, privately with the senior leaders behind the scenes, provosts, vice presidents, and all the folks leading the major silos within schools. The decision we made to change that. We want to get a lot of the ideas that we have out there more broadly available to folks like you so that you can write about things and hopefully refer to us if you need to for a quote or as an expert. So this is sort of a test case in that we'd like to get out there a little bit more and share with you some of the ideas that we have. I want to share with you a couple of things that we're doing around student success. We are a research company at our heart. We're a research and insights company is how we talk about ourselves. However, a lot of the best practices that we highlight, and we do this, by the way, by talking with hundreds of different folks at schools across the course of a year around a specific problem, finding maybe the 10 best ideas on how to solve that problem. Student success comes up every single year. Around that idea, though, in the last few years, there's been a big push towards better technology and better use of data to understand who's at risk and who's not. So we've actually begun to develop software ourselves. We have a group, we call it the Student Success Collaborative. It's over 110 institutions. They range, again, across the country. A lot of them are members of our research forums. Every single one of these schools is contributing about 10 years worth of student data. We're doing a tremendous amount of risk analysis for them. We're actually risk coding individual students, red, yellow, green, help schools understand who's at risk there. And we're deploying it all to people at different levels of the institution. Provosts get to see a whole sort of map, a dashboard of who's at risk at their school. Individual on-the-ground advisors get to see how this particular student's at risk and what are the factors driving that risk. And our hope here is that we'd be able to advise the student better or even remove some systemic challenges. Let me talk to you a little bit more about some of the success challenges that we're seeing because, and it's come up today quite a bit. I've been looking at the success issues since I started at EAB at the very beginning. We have heard all along how student success, the drive to do it, the drive to push harder on this is a moral imperative. It's the right thing to do for students. We've got pressure from our states. Now there's performance funding. There's an issue of national competitiveness, issues of institutional reputation and rankings, and all that stuff is still there. It's still really important, and it's still pushing schools. But there's a brand new thing, really, that we're hearing from our members in the last 10, or call it 12, 18 months. And there's a financial imperative here as well. The landscape right now is such that in many areas of the country, the high school populations are either declining or flattening or declining. And if you talk to these schools, what they're finding is that, well, their state funding has gone away, never to come back. Their endowments are in shambles. They are no longer able to raise their tuition. SMU may be able to charge $60,000 a year, but they are in the exception relative across the country. If you raise your price tag, you're going to raise your discount rate, your net tuition is not going to go up. So these schools are having trouble maintaining the revenue streams. The only way they were going to grow revenue was to expand the size of their first year class. They can't do that anymore. They're fighting each other for students. They're fighting each other for transfer students. And there's a much tougher competitive environment if you think about the online providers, community colleges, and lots of other modalities to get learning. So the only thing that they can really do to grow enrollments, to paraphrase Pacino from Any Given Sunday, is the students they need are all around them. The ones that are on their campus right now, they need to keep them around longer and longer, hopefully all the way to graduation. But now in addition to the moral imperative, there's a financial imperative. And schools are beginning to think this way. So for instance, we work with Southern Illinois University. They experienced a 3.6% improvement in first to second term persistence for the first year students. They verbalize it as saying that's annualized to $1 million in tuition revenue. Schools are beginning to run models, though, that suggest that very small improvements, more across the board. Here we ran a model that was a 1% improvement in the first year, 2% in the second year, and 1% in the third year, across 3 years. So very attainable gains are actually worth really big bucks for these schools. So in this case, $10 million, and this is a real institution, pretty typical directional Midwestern state type institution. So there's a lot of money on the line, and you don't have to improve that much to meet the revenue goals that you might be missing out on otherwise. So this is an entirely new meme that's out there, and maybe one that you'll be writing more about in the next couple of weeks as you read and even write stories about schools that are missing their enrollment targets. So it's definitely out there. Schools are definitely starting to think about it. It's really just a cusp, and it's a total change. We've only seen in the last year in our conversations with folks. So pay more attention to this one over time. But what this strategy also suggests is that very focused outreach against a specific target population. Oops, there you go, thank you. Very focused outreach against a specific target population that's high ROI can generate these gains. It changes our strategy from being a broad brush approach, trying to save all students to maintaining that, but also doing specific outreach targeted to limited populations of students that we think we can turn around. So is that currently how we're approaching student success at schools? The answer is no. The vast majority of student success initiatives are focused on a first year population because that's the biggest possible year for dropout, or the biggest known year for dropout. 40 to 50% of students leave school after the first year. But they're actually possibly the toughest to turn around. A lot of these students come in and just academically crater. They're going to be on probation. They're not coming back for the next year. Another big chunk of those students decide that they don't like you very much. This is not the school for me. This is a bad fit. I want to go back home, or I want to go to a bigger school or a smaller school or a school with a football team or a school where my boyfriend is. Whatever it might be, they're not coming back for the second year. It has nothing to do, and it might actually be hard for you to turn that student around because they just simply didn't like it here. When we look at the data about who's actually dropping out, and we have a database now of 650,000 students that we're doing a lot of research on to understand where dropout occurs, we're seeing a really interesting pattern that has gone almost entirely overlooked by schools. The dark bars here represent first-year dropout against first-year GPA. So these are students who don't come back for the second year based on how they did in the first year. And sure enough, on the left, you see those students who just did very poorly academically that did not come back. But on the right side, you see lots of students who don't come back in the first year, a huge population of students that's blue who don't come back sometime after the first year. So they come back for sophomore year and then drop out later on. And then the lighter gray bar is the students that graduate. So what you're seeing here is a huge opportunity to focus on what we're calling the murky middle. These are sophomores and beyond who are kind of doing all right, but they're still not going to graduate. They represent a population of students who likes your school. They came back for sophomore year. They're doing academically okay. They're not on probation, and they're closer to graduation than the first year students. We like this population. There could be a big opportunity here. The big issue for schools, though, is understanding, well, how do I sort out in this population the students that are going to graduate from the ones that won't? We call it the murky middle. schools tend to deploy their resources in a sort of an interesting way. The students who get the most attention tend to be either the very best students. Why? Because they come in and ask for help. Or the very worst students, because they're obviously at risk. Often overlooked is this middle group. They tend not to get much. They don't go in and ask for it, and nobody's really noticing that they're in trouble. But in order to actually pinpoint and go after this population, you need to actually be able to do much more sophisticated analyses, laser-like, to point out or to pick out this population and develop campaigns or outreach strategies or some sort of interventions around that. This is what we're helping schools do. So I'm just going to quickly show you two kinds of data, and we'll visualize it in two students, Billy and Bobby. Imagine that you're at university and you see these two students and they look virtually identical to you. They both have 2.7 GPAs. Which one's going to graduate and which one won't? Well, Billy had got to the 2.7 with a mixtures of A's, B's, and C's across all his different courses. Bobby, on the other hand, is getting B's and C's in the major coursework and A's in the electives. That's actually a huge difference. When we run analyses for schools, what we find is your performance, especially in introductory courses, the actual grades you get are highly predictive of whether or not you're going to graduate in that major or maybe even overall. The surprise finding here is that students who get C's in introductory courses often do just as poorly in the major as students who get F's. So they pass the class, but not really. They're not going to go on to graduate in that major. They didn't develop the foundational knowledge they need to succeed in the next course on. You pull enough of these courses together and you begin to get a picture of why Bobby may not be the one that's going to graduate. What's interesting here, though, is that since we've worked with 110 schools, what we've discovered is every school is different. Every course is different. You have to run this analysis for every single major on campus. And sometimes really different patterns and sometimes unexpected things develop. Another thing you can look at between these two is how did they reach that 2.7? So Billy reached his 2.7 by accelerating. Last semester, he got maybe a 2.2. He's getting better over time. Long story short, students who improve graduate, students who don't improve don't graduate. What this is allowing schools to do is if they understand what factors, we lost it. If we understand what factors are contributing to success or failure, and if we're able to develop risk algorithms that pinpoint and target students who are code students red, yellow, green based on how at risk our models are suggesting they could be, it allows a school to design an outreach campaign that, just for example, I want to look at students who are in their sophomore year of biology majors between a 2.5 and a 3.0 that the model is telling me are red risk. Students that otherwise would go completely fly under the radar, nobody would notice them, but they may actually represent the best opportunity to quickly turn around a population of students and get them to graduate if they may not otherwise. And that's essentially what the nugget of our work with SSC is. I'm sure I've gone way over my time, so I want to build the rest of it before I cause any more damage.
Well, we'll come back to what you've learned from these 600 or so schools. Shari, do you want to talk a little bit about the 7 that you're working with?
Okay, yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. Okay.
Do we want to risk the slides or?
Well, it's just one slide. It's okay. If it basically, I just had one slide which indicates the 7 schools I'm working with and what they're doing, so I didn't have to read it off. And if any of you if it's in your area, then you'll know about it. But basically, I'm Shari Garmise. I'm the vice president for the Office of Urban Initiatives for the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities and the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities. We recently got a large grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in which we had a sort of big RFP process, and a number of urban universities basically defined by those who serve their urban area, so that the students usually come from the urban area, trained in the urban schools, and then when they graduate, I guess if they graduate, then return and provide the urban, the workforce in their urban and metropolitan area. Anyway, we had a process and we selected 7 of those institutions to work and to develop what we call the Transformational Planning Grant project. So they have a year in which to plan for innovations that hopefully they will implement in their university. And this responds, and now I think I'm in a really lucky situation right now, is because of the nature of what we're doing. I think I have an opportunity to pull together a lot of what we've been talking about. And I'm going to actually follow directly from Ed. Is part of the challenges, as you know, universities are being challenged on all scales. It's pretty strong in publics, it's pretty strong in community colleges, but it is to a certain extent across the board. Their financial model is collapsing. I mean, it's based on tuition and in the public state funding, and all of its, as you know, is under pressure. And so they're challenged to not only think through new business models, and we're talking about that this morning, find really new ways to maintain quality in teaching. I mean, how do you deal with changing finances, but still maintain the quality and, in very cases, educate as many, if not more. So basically, what we did is we selected a cohort of institutions who were literally implementing new or different types of business models that speak to a variety of areas of change where it's needed. Some we heard about this morning. Some are doing competency-based learning, modularization, literally adapting whole structures to better incorporate adult students and the needs of adult students, which are very different when they're working full-time, need different sorts of conveniences. We're seeing really very strong regional collaborative structures and others, that regional ecosystems where we find stronger partnerships, alignment between K through 12 and higher ed institutions. Literally, I think one of the things we didn't talk about or we mentioned briefly in the development ed situation is how the degree to which education is a spectrum. And as we learn along the line, it would be better if we could coordinate at every point in that situation so that when they hit college, they knew what they learned in high school. And you think that it should be aligned, but it very often isn't, especially when you look at the K through 12 connection. So anyway, another area where we're seeing a major sort of thrust or transformational change is the use of analytics. And I'd almost like to take a step back and say, well, okay, so we've got data. What's new and what's different? And I think the key point I'd like to make is, as was said earlier this morning, a lot of data is sort of mostly collected around, one, it's compliance oriented for the federal government, for grants, for programs, et cetera. And it was also siloed across the institution. It was in one area, one department collects one data, one school of education school collects another data, and it's never been put together. And the third area is, most importantly, it's always backward looking. It could tell us what students used to do. It could tell us what we knew in the past. But what this whole new analytics movement is taking data and turning it into actionable so that it's real time, it's based on observable student behavior, and it's forward looking. It can be used now to address issues now. And the goal here, and I think is for it to be ultimately holistic to the student. In other words, we talk about aggregates, and we're developing aggregate understandings based on what we know about all students, but it has to be applied to the individual student for their own personal decision making. And I think what is, and I know that we'll probably be discussing this a lot later in more detail, I'm sure, but how we literally are able to put that together for student success. Now, here's another question is, but why is this sort of transformational? What kind of push can this do at a university level? And I think one of the things we're seeing is, as we're able to understand the student at that level, it starts to unearth. The more we understand about courses at the aggregate level, it starts to unearth all of the bottlenecks existing in the university. And they mentioned it earlier, but things like all of the students are failing X class, and they figure if they fail X class, they can't move forward. But some of the data unearths will know, actually, it's the class before. So that you have to then restructure the pathway in a very different way. The other piece of it is, as you move kids through faster, we mentioned it earlier, you actually may have to restructure the scheduling of your classes now that you've learned more about them. You also got to do, and I'm going to answer a question somebody answered earlier. How do you advise a student? Well, you use the data to advise the student for you. Because suddenly you don't have to say, well, generally from my personal experience, if you failed this, you probably won't do well. Instead, you get to say, well, you know what? 97% of students who fail this course don't pass this one. Now, you may be one of the 3%. And if you are, this is what you're going to have to do to pass. If you aren't, this is how we're going to help you pass, or this is how we're going to help you decide what comes next. So that the analytics becomes part of a change process within the university. And so what you're also going to start to see as a result of better data is reallocation of resources within the university itself. So suddenly you actually may have more advising systems. You have more advisors who can actually manage. You may find you need more support in a particular area. All of a sudden you need more, more tutors for math. But it's the data that's starting to make that decision for you, and it's done in real time, not 5 years ago. And I think the way I sort of wanted to, so that's sort of brought it. And I think, the question is, well, what do you need to look for or ask about when you're thinking about data? I think one of the key things that I've noticed we haven't talked about that is critical is what data are we talking about? Okay, there's the analytical data that is about student decision making. There's the learning data that the teachers are now collecting in real time in their classroom. Who's using the data? Is the data given to students? Is it given to faculty? Is it given to deans? Is it given to departments? I mean, it sounds like the initial who, what, when, why, but this is actually critical. Who's given the data and what decision has to be made around it? Because the data is a tool. It's a tool to actually support decision-making at a more complex level and unearthing the realities, I think, of what's going on campus. And so I'll leave with that because I think I've overdone my time too, haven't I?
I sort of get caught up in this. All of you. Yeah. And Stephanie, I'm hoping you can talk. We've gone from 600 schools to 7, and I'm hoping you can talk really concretely about what you're doing here.
Absolutely.
With this data.
Absolutely. Hi, guys. I'm Stephanie Dupaul, and I work here at Southern Methodist University. I'm the Associate Provost, and I oversee admissions and financial aid and the bursar and the registrar and fun things like that. And I've been here a long time. I've been in higher ed for 25 years. I've been here at SMU for almost 20. When I first came to SMU, I was actually an academic advisor. One of my jobs, I was an academic advisor, and I had an 8-ball collection. On my desk, a collection of 8 balls, because students would sit across from me and say, well, can I pass that class? And I would literally pick up an 8-ball and say, well, let's see. I don't know if you're going to go to class every day. I don't know if you're going to buy the textbook. I don't know if your dog will be run over on the day of the midterms. I can't predict, but according to the 8-ball, all signs point to yes. Congratulations, welcome to Shakespeare. So it was a very different time, and students actually found it amusing. So they started bringing me 8 balls, and I have a very extensive 8-ball collection now, including sarcastic ball, excuse ball, you name it. I've got them all. So that was a very different world for data, needless to say. And it's been interesting transitioning back to working in admissions, looking at the way we use data in admissions, and now seeing that roll forward into the much more extensive use of data as a tool in predicting student success and student retention, which is really important at every school, not just the 600, not just the 7, but also just 1. So I'm really grateful that we're talking about this today, because we really do, at the core, want our students to be successful. When we enroll our class, where our new students started last week, and we hit census data next week, that is not the point at which we know if we're successful or not. We will know we're successful 4 years from now, right? When we look back at the class that just started last week, and if they're still here and they're graduating, we'll know that's the point at which we're successful. And it is incredibly important for the reasons that have been articulated before. It's a resource issue. It's a reputational issue. It does impact, I'll say the R word, the rankings. It's something that impacts a lot of what we do. It is less expensive for us to keep a student than recruit a student, right? We didn't admit them because we wanted them to leave. We had admitted them because we wanted them to stay. We wanted them to become alumni. So it's really important as we look at the tools that we have available to us, and we look at expanding those tools, that we remember that is our mission, that's our function. We want to bring students here so we can shape them to be the world changers that are going to make all of our lives much, much better in the future. So what this tool does for us, what using data and the influence of data and what we do does, it gives us a different way to look at information. What it does not do for us, it doesn't drive us to action. It does not account adequately for human behavior sometimes. That aggregate data it doesn't predict everybody's actions, right? So it has its limitations. But it's very important, especially in a school like SMU that's been working very hard to change. Over the last decade, we've doubled our applicant pool without increasing our first-year class size. We've increased student quality. 100 points on the SAT. We've increased diversity from 16% to 27%. So we've made a lot of changes. And so that's given us some tensions. It's meant that retention and attrition are things that we need to talk about more because we're not the same school we were a decade ago. And so using data, we've been able to look at our retention, and we've made that a real priority for the institution. So data can help us identify factors that might be triggers, and it's really, really important that we do that in an individual institution context, as well as working with organizations like EAB to understand the national landscape. The individual institutional context is incredibly important, and it makes the data look very different and operate differently when you look at it on our levels. So just a sense of what we have done to talk about retention at SMU. We've always been fortunate. We're a very fortunate institution to have things like free tutoring. Did you guys go on the tour this morning? A few of you, yeah. So you might have gone to talked about the Learning Enhancement Center, which has free tutoring, has time management workshops. They have a great workshop on procrastination that I still haven't been to. They're optimists over there. We have professional academic advising, we have orientation systems, we have all those bells and whistles that should keep our students successful. But just like the rest of the nation, we plateaued on retention. We got stuck like everybody else on retention and graduation rates, and we really needed something to push us to get better. And we really needed some tools and some resources. So one of the first things that we did is we made retention and graduation rates part of our strategic plan. Later tonight, I'm sure you'll hear from the president. It's our birthday, and as part of our 100th birthday, we developed a centennial strategic plan. And one of the very specific goals articulated in that plan was related to retention and graduation rates. So that made that a university-level priority, and that's incredibly important. We created a new position reporting directly to the provost, an assistant provost who's over retention and student success. So again, that high-level engagement from our administration was really, really important. We did a lot of research. In fact, we just completed a research study that we just redid, looking at first semester, second year, and 4-year retention. We started with 14 variables after the first semester, and then we added additional variables in after second semester, after second year, and at graduation, up to we're now at 20 variables by the time you get to the 4-year group, to try and see what works here and what doesn't work here. And in looking at that multivariate model, we found some things that match nationally. We found some things that don't. We found some things that surprised us. And it's important to know what those things look like on an individual campus. One of the things that came out of that, we discovered that students who apply earlier retain more frequently. That's been interesting to look at, and we've not used that to inform the admissions process, but we are certainly conscious of it when students get here. So a student who comes to SMU who didn't apply early, we're sort of aware they might need a little extra hand-holding to fit in, to feel at home. We noted that the more frequently students visited before they came impacted their retention at the university. Some majors had higher retention rates, some ethnicities, some genders. There were a lot of different factors we could look at. So we put all that together and we looked at things we could change. So one thing, for example, we changed is we'd always had an orientation system. It was a summer orientation where you register, and then there was an optional thing we call Mustang Corral. We're the Mustangs, you know that, right? We had Mustang Corral, which is sort of like a camp for first-year students. We made that mandatory because we wanted to make sure that all of our students had this bonding experience together, that they all came together as a class. And so all of our students now go to our Mustang Corral before school starts. So we used data that we gathered to inform some of our programs and some of our activities. We changed our mid-year warning report so that it's now an early warning report as well as a mid-year warning report. We also changed it so it's not just for first-year students, because retention is not a first-year issue. Retention is a 4-year issue. So we do mandatory midterm and early reporting for first and second year for all transfer students and for certain key courses which we found to be trigger courses that may have an impact, a stronger impact on successes for the students. We started a program called CCC, the Caring Community Concerns Form. This is a way for faculty and staff to report a student who they're worried about for whatever reason. It may be that a student's missing class. It may be that a student seems disengaged. It may be that someone in the cafeteria noticed they haven't swiped in for a meal in a day or two, and they're eating somewhere. What's going on? The Caring Communities Concerns program, they meet weekly. They go through all the CCCs, and they farm them out for direct intervention for the appropriate people through resident assistance, sometimes for just a phone call from a faculty member. We farm those out and make sure students know that we're watching out for them. We also developed, just in the past few years, multiple cohort-based programs to support the retention of students. We have one called Mustang Bridge, which is geared for our first-generation students, low-income students, and also for students who are kind of in the bottom 25% of our entering class academically. We're fortunate all of our students are super and they're smart and wonderful, but even smart and wonderful has a bottom quarter of smart and wonderfulness. And those students do struggle a little bit more. So Mustang Bridge is there to provide more aggressive and intrusive advising and support for those students. And we are going to a residential commons model. We just started last year, so all of our students will live on campus for 2 years in residential commons with a faculty member. And we're really excited about that and are excited to see how that will impact retention. So we've done a lot, and we have seen successful changes. We've seen our retention increase. Our four-year graduation rate has increased 7%. Our 6-year graduation rate has increased 5%. So we've had some great successes moving numbers that are notoriously hard to move, because the reality is if you're already kind of in a good place, every step up is harder. It's easy to climb the bottom of a mountain. It's very difficult to climb the top of a mountain. And so we're pleased with the results that we've seen. Just a couple things to wrap up, because I always go too long as well, sorry. But I did want to touch on the conference theme and kind of just tell you my thoughts on the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to this type of data and using this type of information to develop predictive models. The good is when data can inform what types of interactions are needed to help a student be successful. That's absolutely the good. The good is when the data serves the students and their success. The bad is when data is used to weed out students. The bad is when data doesn't take into account personal, individual motivation and choices. The bad is when students aren't given a chance to succeed because they trigger too many of your danger points on your data scales. And the ugly is that the data can't tell the whole story. The ugly is that the data might become the next siren song that leads our ship to the rocks, right? If we overinvest and overtrust the data, we can find ourselves in some rocky territory. So the bad is that if we serve the data too much, we may be serving a performance agenda and not serving the institutional mission. So there is a good, a bad, and an ugly. We have to remember this is one tool in a toolbox, and it's a tool we should use wisely and carefully, and that we definitely should use, but it shouldn't be the only tool. That's what I have.
So when we talk about data, it's this really abstract term, and I'm hoping all of you can get at a little bit more closely what these data points are that you're looking at. One thing that's, when we talk about graduation rates, an error that a lot of people make, certainly an error I make a lot, is you look at a college with a 45% graduation rate and you say, you have a 45% chance of graduating from that college, which is actually not true at all. It's called the ecological fallacy. And I learned that like a year ago, and I've been writing about graduation rates for longer than that. So that's embarrassing. So one of the things that these data points do is actually, let you look at a student and say, no, the institution has a 45% graduation rate, but you have an 89% chance of graduating. Mm-hmm. So what are the things you look at that go into this picture of who a given student is and help you to see what potential outcomes there might be down the road? Do you want to start?
Sure. So we, of course, face that challenge. Maybe back up a little bit in the history, right? So in understanding what success factors or what factors are predictive of success and failure, the history has been we make use of the information that we've had. And for the most part, that's stuff that you collect in the admissions process, largely demographic. So historically speaking, a predictive model, not very sophisticated one, would say if you're of a certain ethnicity, of a certain gender, from a certain zip code, applying for financial aid or not, then you're less likely to graduate. And that's some sort of prediction. These aren't very good models. So we wanted to get away from this. In fact, we think that all of that is just masking really what comes down to, are you prepared and can you pay for it? That being said, all of these things tend to get washed out or at least muted when a student actually starts doing things on campus. And in fact, we find that there's a half-life to high school information. Once a student comes in and starts taking classes at your school, that information has more predictive power than anything beyond that. But we know there's a ton of information that could be out there about students that we could use. Our biggest issue was it's pretty spotty. In fact, there's very few data sources on campus that you have comprehensively for all students that are also predictive. In other words, that give you signal. There's been a lot that's been spoken or much ink that's been spilled about, well, what if we could use swipe card data to track students' movement around campus? Some schools have tried it. It's hard. So we chose to look just at academic data, not saying that only academic data was, there's only an academic issue, but we knew we could get it for every student. We knew that there was a big, long history record transcripts sitting at universities that we could mine, and we knew that it was fairly predictive success. It may not be telling you exactly what the problem is, but it can tell you where the problem is. The student struggling in class, they may not understand the material. They may not be prepared. They might be working 40 hours a week. They might have 2 kids that they're trying to balance against schoolwork. There's some issue here, but it's showing up in their grades. So at least it can point us to where the problem is if it can't even tell us, if it can't tell us specifically what the problem is. So that's why we chose to look at that data set, although there's a wealth of different kind of data out there that folks could go at. I'm sure you guys probably have actually tackled that. So just pass that.
So we, in our study, we looked at, the traditional for the high school entering folks, grades, test scores. We looked at gender, race. We looked at their age at entry, the type of high school they attended, whether it was public or private, if they were in or out of state, if they were legacy students, first-generation students, their ethnic background, and the timeline of their admission process, if they visited campus before they came. Once they were here, we added on if they were a commuter student or lived on campus. We added on their academic performance, and for that we looked at the GPA earned in the first semester, second semester, and so on, the number of C's, D's, F's, and W's withdrawals that they had, the number of hours they attempted and hours they earned each semester. On the midterm and early warning reports, we look at attendance, we look at classroom performance, and we look at classroom grades, mid-semester grades. And we also looked at marital status, honors hours, veteran status, and finally, whether or not they were involved in a Greek organization. So all of that is factored in. Not everything was found to be predictive.
Okay, I'm going to probably skirt this question a little bit since I'm not on a campus and I don't data. And I just to make one point as we think about it, because I think one of the things that we want to make sure we remember is data is not always numbers, and there is as equally important qualitative data as there is quantitative data. The problem is harder to capture and it's harder to package in a vessel that's available and accessible to others. I mean, the thing about numbers is, you say 67% graduate, you know exactly what that means, more or less. I mean, as we unpack it, we realize you don't, but you think you do. You think, in others, but a number, it's neat, it's clean, and that's it's actually its beauty, and that's its ugliness as well. And so the other thing I like to make is as an example of using alternatives, because I said I'll point to some of my 7. One of the things that they are experimenting with are accessing how do you get to the so-called non-cognitives? I mean, how do you start to measure kids who are kids or adults who are applying, who have grit, who have perseverance? And so we're starting to see experimentations with essay-based approaches and other approaches that are trying to dig into and to a certain extent add some quantitative layering to the qualitative factors that we know are just as important, but up till now we've had to rely on the more quantitative because they are the most easily accessible. They're the ones that are easiest to use, and again, they're probably the easiest to make your case with.
The grit factor is a great one. That's one we've all talked about in the admissions world as well as in the retention world. How you measure someone's resilience and their ability to bounce back. There's been some great research done at the University of Pennsylvania on this, and some other folks working on developing a grit index. And we actually talked about trying to use that in the admissions process here at SMU, but our fear became, if kids can prep the SAT, boy, I bet they can prep a grit test too. Let's see, what would have been the hardest thing to do? That's what I would have done. Yeah. But it's that measuring that non-quantitative, that human character of strength and resilience. I think that's what accounts for the kids who don't fit the model. When you're looking at predictive demographics, when you've got 97% of people who made that grade will fail the next class, who are those 3%? They're the grit kids. They're the kids who know how to fight through, who self-advocate. And identifying those is the real challenge I think we all face.
Yeah, grit would be, that's sort of the holy grail. Right?
Yeah.
We want to get at that one. It's also the hardest. If you guys want to read up on it, William Sedlicek out of Maryland had done the most on non-cognitive assessment. And there were actually some schools out there, Oregon State I can think of, incorporated into their admissions process a non-cog assessment. Pretty simple stuff, like tell me about a challenge you overcame. That was their essay question. If the student had overcome a challenge, that was a good thing. Didn't really matter what the challenge was. I think they put something in place at the Michigan Law School and a few other places. It's something we'd all like to get a lot more at, and a lot more research is required.
So I was just thinking about this. I cover K-12 now as well, and we hear about grit all the time. And I'm sure some of you do too. And if you cover charter schools or if you cover ed reform, it is like everywhere. This is actually the first I've heard it talked about much in higher ed. So it's interesting to see that that's sort of trickling up to the admissions level.
Well, that's
Absolutely. But the problem, we do get students who say, oh my gosh, but nothing bad ever happened to me my whole life, so I can't get into a good college. Boy.
So there's, obviously there's a lot of promise to this. There are some kind of troubling aspects, I think, of this amount of knowledge we have that jump out to me as well. The one that really comes to mind is there was a famous experiment in the 60s where they told teachers that half of the class was going to make tremendous intelligence gains that year, and the other half were dumb kids who were not going anywhere. And it was totally random. It had nothing to do with anything they knew about the kids or about their abilities. But at the end of the year, the half that they had said were going to make progress had in fact made progress because they had been unconsciously favored. It seems like there's sort of a danger of that here, either of this creeping its way into the admissions process or of influencing faculty and advisors. How do we guard against the negative possibilities of knowing this much?
Yeah. Well, we get asked that a lot, as you might imagine. And to build context, we're actually risk scoring students. As I said, red, yellow, green. So I could tell you if you were my university, there's a third of you are red, a third of you are yellow, a third of you are green. It's all about how you use this information and how you frame it. It's pretty widely understood as don't show it to the student. That's number one. Under any circumstance. The other thing is that you have to understand is that for an individual student, you're not red. You're red in what you're doing right now, or you're not yellow, whatever it might be. So for every student that we have, we're actually running what-if analyses on, well, in this program, you might not be predicted to do terribly well, but there are a couple programs on campus that actually you would be green if you went to. So it's more nuanced than simply this student's struggling. You're struggling in what you're attempting right now. Another thing that we need to frame this around is predictions are not destiny. We tell this to every single one of our members. Don't fall into that trap. This is a current assessment of what's going on with the student right now. And to make it a little more fun, I often bring up look at your CD collection from 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Could you have predicted your musical tastes based on what you had at that moment right now? No, you changed. Things change over time. What we're saying is if nothing changed, this would be bad. So let's get something better going on here. The whole point is to move forward. The other thing is we're framing around, use risk as an identification tool to understand the hidden students that are actually going the wrong direction that you otherwise would miss. But again, use it as a tool to identify things that you can improve, not start segmenting and doing sort of a sorting and hat kind of thing early on. And I think the last thing that we're trying to do is say, again, don't channel students to things that are easy. Don't channel them to the green major simply because they're green. Help students make better decisions such that they understand, am I getting from a bad situation to a worse situation if I move from this major to this major, if I don't take this class, or if I get this grade?
I'd probably just add, I think also at this point recognize not all the data is shared equally to the same folks. Advisors get one set of data, faculty may get another, students may get another, administrative may get another. So that's sort of number one. It's not as if there's this sort of data set that everybody accesses and can see all of the points. So that's number one. But I think too, who gets the data, it's about interpretation. But equally, it's not just about the students, it's about what you can do to support the student. So it's not that you're predicting them to go one way versus another. It's given what we know, if you want to do this, you may need additional supports X. And I think the other thing we also want to recognize that the data is not just used to address the student at the point of the student. It's also used at the level of the university enterprise to make some pretty increasingly hard resource allocations decisions. I mean, you may find, depending on who your student body is, that you may now actually have to reallocate resources from one place to another. And the nice thing about the data is it gives you that built-in narrative as to why you need to do it, which, as you know, making decisions across university enterprises is very difficult because you've got to push so many different semi-independent autonomous elements from faculty to administration to trustees. So the data is how you use it to make the decision, and not everyone sees the same data points. So the question actually is who sees what data points for what decision?
And what type of training they get.
Yes, and that's key.
You've got to make sure people realize that 2/3 of the student success is the student, not the institution. So it's training that's very, very, very important in talking to people about the data that they receive and how to use it. And expectations to students, what you do communicate to students is not the expectation that they're at risk. In the Mustang Bridge program, one of the great tools we have used is the fact that the director of the program sits down with the students and tells them what GPA he expects them to make. He expects them to make a 3.5. He expects them to make nothing less than a B. Where he's getting that number is from his expectation, not from the data. The data predicts these students will be probably in the 2.7 range. And when at the end of the first year, when we compare those students to peers with similar backgrounds, their peers are in the 2.7 range. But the students who he sat down and have said, I expect you to make a 3.5, their average GPA is about between a 3.1 and a 3.2. So there's definitely the need to, when you're going to label people, to label them with your expectation of success, because that is also a motivating factor that is useful.
I think we're going to go ahead and start taking questions. Are there microphones to go around? Okay, great. Start up here. And please introduce yourself and say where you're from as well.
Good afternoon. Jamal Abdul-Alim, freelance writer from Washington, D.C. Before I was an education reporter, I started out as a crime reporter. And as anyone in here who's ever been a crime reporter knows, you spend a lot of time dealing with autopsies and medical examiners' reports in order to learn more about the demise of the deceased. And I'll come back to why I bring that up. I also used to be a chess journalist. And as a chess journalist, when we analyze games, we do what's called a post-mortem analysis in order to figure out what move in the series of moves was the fatal move for the player. In other words, at what point did he lose the game? I applied some of those principles as a crime reporter and as a chess journalist, as an education writer, when I visited my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, in order to learn more about why students were dropping out, not completing their degrees. And I struck pay dirt when I found a file cabinet with files of students who had dropped out. And don't ask me how, but I was able to get access to some of their transcripts. I didn't get any identifying information or anything like that. But I was able to examine or have someone examine on my behalf the transcripts in order to learn more about the reason that students had dropped out. And in 3 out of 5 of the transcripts, the students had not completed the math requirement. It appears as though that was the primary stumbling block for them. So I said all that to say this is how common or uncommon is it to do a post-mortem analysis, or an autopsy, if you will, of students who've dropped out of college in order to learn more about what would be successful at keeping them in.
Are you doing autopsies? Do you want to talk about it?
Every single predictive model is a post-mortem autopsy because it's all based on historical data assessing, well, how this student is doing compared to students in the past. So your Amazon book recommendations are post-mortem autopsies of everybody who's come before. Sorry to keep using the morbid analogy. Everybody who's come before who was like you, who liked that book. So because you're looking at that trail of data to make an assessment about this student, you're naturally looking at a trail of data that's showing you these failure points, the fatal flaw in the chess game, as you mentioned. Was it something to do with their GPA in a nursing program? By the way, that's a huge problem. Was it, a killer combination of courses? Was it that they put off the math requirement? Which is also, absolutely true. I can verify that happens across the nation. So it's kind of all like that. You're looking backwards to look forwards. So.
I have a question here, and this sort of picks up on some concerns that Libby mentioned. Is there a danger of stereotyping and nudging students in the direction of where people like them have historically done well? If people are not as careful in how they interpret the data as you all are being, what do you do with if the data show that, for instance, very few Black females end up being successful engineers? Is there a danger that you're going to be pushing students in a direction based on stereotypes?
If you're remaining true to the mission of your institution, that should not be a danger. If the mission of the institution is access and education, that should not be a danger. And what you do when you have data showing that African American don't do well in engineering is you develop support systems to engage your African American female students in cohort groups. You reach out to provide tutoring models. You try and build an engineering school that has a higher ratio of female students. We've gotten up to 36%. We're thrilled. Trying to go more. You use the data not to exclude women from engineering, but instead to identify that as a place that could use an allocation of resources. And that is the hard part. I'm so glad you brought that up. What the data should inform is your decision as a university on where you're going to put your resources to maximize student success.
Yeah, I think, and I suppose there's always dangers, but I think one of the things I think about is that one of the things that marks, I think, the predictive analytics today of the sort of data of yesterday is the ability, one, to combine huge numbers of data sets and data sources that were never able to be combined in the past, so that you have a much larger range of data points to be able to extract actionable patterns. So it doesn't use them all. It's looking at patterns that are relevant, but it's a wide set. And the other piece of it is those sets, as you watch universities who already use predictive analytics, they're getting bigger and wider, because what happens, like with most data, unfortunately, it doesn't always answer all your questions. It asks more. And it starts to also reveal things that used to be fact now becomes myth. And I'll give you an example. And I think one of the things I'll put on, because I think it's actually important to the discussion we're having here writ large that we haven't mentioned at all that I remember. But a lot of the discussion is sort of assumed that students drop out because of academics. In a lot of universities, they drop out because of finances. And not they owe $6,000. A lot of times they owe $650. So little points like that, and the ability to take that and keep not only but build those sets further and further out, start giving us more and more power, as long as, again, we keep them within the parameters of a decision-making tool, not a predeterminative outcome.
So I'm going to preface with what I say by saying I 100% agree with both of you on your comments. I'm going to offer a counterexample, though.
Okay.
But again, I'm offering this counterexample just for the interest of discussion. When do we have a responsibility of looking at that data and saying, you're not going to make it? So, and I'll use the nursing example again. If you guys are familiar with nursing programs, they're highly competitive by design. And there's really two reasons for that. And by highly competitive, I mean for pre-nursing students, your average pre-nursing student entering at a even very good large public university has a 10 to 20% chance of graduating with a nursing degree. Only the very best get into that program, because we want the eye of the needle on this. They are healthcare providers, and we want the best of the best doing that. Also, nursing is fantastically expensive to teach. If you've ever been in a upper division nursing classroom, they have fancy robots and stuff. I have a picture on my phone I can show you. It's great. So as a result, students are being turned away from these programs with 3.5 GPAs. What happens to these students? Well, they've done 2 years of college. They pursued all these fancy nursing courses. They have a choice to make. They're either dead set on becoming nurses, at which point they drop out of the school. And one of our partners, Georgia State, has actually done an analysis of what happens to their ex-nursing students. A big chunk of them go get associate's degrees. A bigger chunk of them get nothing. They go and try nursing somewhere else and fail there as well. So we have a really good student who's gotten at least 2 years, if not more, of college under their belt. But because they're sort of very tunnel vision on that one goal of becoming a nurse, they won't get a college degree at all. And they're a good student, and we could see it coming a mile away, right? So at what point do we have the responsibility of saying, because I have this perspective, I have to tell you something. I have to crush this dream. But I want to replace it with a new one. So how do we help you get to your career goal, which is really to work in the healthcare industry? And there's a lot of other ways to get there besides becoming a nurse. But let's get you to that goal and let you get that goal early as possible. So this is just a counterexample where I've got the data. I have to tell you something, right? So, but again, I agree with what you guys are saying. Absolutely. It's more about identifying the opportunity and fixing it. But there are situations where I think we have a responsibility.
Okay, so I'm Rena, and I'm a freelance journalist and an author. And I'm going to actually do an autopsy on my own situation and get opinions on it. So when I was younger, I went to school. I went straight into the spring semester from high school. I graduated a semester early. I studied for a few semesters. Some volunteering I did showed that I didn't want to do the career I originally sought to do, and made a couple of changes. Always wrote, though. And so about junior year, and it wasn't money, it wasn't anything else. It was more so I was just burned out, and I think it was a maturity issue. Well, I would take a course and get an F, and it's like, I know I want to finish college. I don't want to be the only idiot in my family not to, before my brother decided to drop out. And my little brother. So, and both of my older siblings have PhDs. Grit level, generically, I would have done really well. I was always very determined. I was head of every organization I was part of, academically, like in college as well. And so a few years later, when I was really ready, I went back to school. I zoomed through. I did all sorts of things to get transfer credits out, transferring in as a senior. And then I spent 2 more years getting a couple of master's degrees. So what would you have said to me at 21 that was basically flunking out of school with every possible predictor saying that I would be successful?
Except for the failing the class.
Yeah, you wouldn't have been predicted to succeed.
What would you say to that person in that situation? Because there is like this maturity element, which sometimes is the factor that you may be as smart as anything, but just not really truly ready to finish that up yet.
Some students need a gap year. That's the truth of it. And the flag would have been failing. The flag would have been smart student failing classes. Which doesn't lead to the conversation about are you using tutoring and things like that. It's the conversation of what do you want? Is this where you want to be?
Yeah. One of the things that we're starting to see in the data, it's amazing. Students getting mixtures of grades. Those that are going to drop out at that stage of their career, junior, senior year, which is sort of odd to even think about, but a large number of students do leave at that point. You're not alone. They're the ones whose C's are becoming F's, but they have the same number of A's as they always did. So there's that weakening. You're sort of like trucking along, and I sort of mentioned the GPA trend over trend, or term over term trend downward. When you start to have C's convert to F's on your transcript, you got a real problem. That student's about to head on their way out. So you were identifiable, and no, you wouldn't have been predicted to succeed based on some of the factors that we know to be predicted because that was happening to you. But what do you do about that? Did anybody talk to you? Would have been my question. And you certainly weren't going to volunteer like, hey, I don't know what's going on here. Like, I'm a little, I don't know if I'm kind of burned out. I don't like it. Most students aren't walking in the door saying that. And if they are, do they even know where to go? So there's a thing that the school has to do, which is be a little bit proactive, identify the student, have a conversation with them. But I would imagine that conversation would have gone a little bit like, you need to take some time off. But let's set it up such that you can come back easily when you're ready.
So for example, here, one thing we started, I guess it was 6 years ago, is we did an expanded leave of absence policy. So for a student who maybe needs to take some time off, you come in, we talk about it, take off a year. You can transfer in classes during that period if you want, but we want to set you up on a leave of absence so that when you come back, we're proactive about getting your financial aid set up. You're able to enroll as a continuing student, so you're not at the back of the line getting the worst classes. We put systems like that in place, so if students do need to step out, stepping back in doesn't create a whole new slew of problems.
I'm thrilled, by the way, that you got back in, and there's recruit back programs that are cropping up now across the country. The oldest and greatest at the University of New Mexico. It's called the Graduation Project, and they go through regularly through their transcripts and look for students who are very close to graduation who left, get them re-enrolled, and they make it as seamless and barrier-free as possible, and even give them a little extra financial aid, and like little simple things like here's a free parking pass, that sort of stuff, because they're likely a commuter student, right? It's that sort of stuff. Make it so easy for them to come back. There's a huge population of students out there with over 120 credits that are like 3 classes away from graduation, and schools could really tap into that. So, and they're you.
Yeah, let me just add one more point to the discussion, because another thing that we're seeing as well is not just what happens when you're in the university and you choose your major and you choose your classes, but a lot of students don't always know what they want to do once they walk in the door. So they're just so that we're starting to see, again, we see analytics, but again, this additional of coordinated tools to support the students. And then what I'm thinking about is there's testing mechanisms that help students identify where their interests are, where their passions are, where their talents lie, ways of combining it, and that becomes another area of data that's used to support the students in making decisions to make sort of career paths, so that it's not simply just what happens when you get there, but it's how do you help them guide the other types of decisions making, as opposed to not nurse or no. Yeah. But what else? What are other things that you could do that would tap into whatever it is that nursing appeals to you?
Yeah.
And the other point I'd like to make, because I think this is actually important to point out, especially as we start to see anybody, anything, any institution embark on new ways of doing things, they're not going to get it all right for everybody. Unfortunately, that's true. But I think what we're seeing is we're getting it right for more often. And maybe that's what's the judgment mechanism on what these things are. And we have to stay vigilant because we want to make sure that the negatives don't get too far into the negative. But we also want to make sure that we don't judge some of the things that fall through the cracks as we're learning and getting better. So that's the other point. I mean, that you can always find an anomaly. And the thing about data is we need to look at what the anomalies really are. Where are they really? Sorry.
It's a question mostly for you, Ed. You said that you basically serve over 600 high education institutions, right? First and foremost, how percentage of I'm not aware right now as of how many universities, how many colleges, how many online colleges, how many high end education institutions do we really have in the landscape, and what percentage that is using analytical data right now to deal with the situation that we have.
That's it.
First question.
Okay.
Second question is
I think I can maybe help answer that one at least.
We use this to analyze an institution, a group of institutions in an area, and actually institutions nationwide. How many, if there are any, using this data to actually recruit students to improve registration, to improve the numbers and the goals that they want to achieve, and if that is a perversion of use of this data.
Yeah.
I think I can take the coverage question.
Please do.
If you don't mind. Well, if you have 600, that's about 10%.
Well, we have 600 in our research membership.
Okay, but they're not
For
all
the
using.
for the technology membership, it's over 110 right now.
Okay.
So,
but there's also people not represented here. WICHE, which is I don't remember what the acronym stands for. I'm not even going to try. No, Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, which is a bunch of Western universities and colleges is using it. They have a huge. It's in terms of the percentage of institutions, it's not huge, but University of Phoenix is in it. I want to say a couple of really large community college systems. I think one of either Cal State or the California Community College System. So in terms of the breadth of institutions, it's quite big, but it's certainly not universal in
Well,
terms of who's using it.
I mean, my read on it is actually like almost every school is doing some sort of predictive algorithm for something. It may just be admissions, but it's really more of a degree of how far they've gone down that road. And my own estimation would be, and I'm just guessing, maybe 20 to 30% of schools out there are all in on this. And they're doing some pretty big things either with us or with PAR or any of the other folks out there, or developing their own. Yeah.
Texas.
Some really cool models are being developed at some schools around their own data because they have access to things. Then there's some other schools that are sort of nibbling at the idea. I've got some things that I'm doing here, and maybe I've got a professor developed a model for the physics program or something like this, and maybe we'd like to take it out a little bit more broadly. And there's some other schools that are just beginning to think about it, and maybe that's 40 to 50% of the population. But we're talking to those folks on a regular basis, and the appetite is among the leadership. We definitely want to start doing this because we see the promise. There's a huge, huge cultural transformation that has to occur at schools like this if they're really going to take advantage of that stuff. And that is a turning the battleship kind of moment for these schools. So we are still years and maybe a decade away from broad, wide-scale adoption. So, and I think your second part of your question was about the admissions process. There's actually a two-part answer to this question, although you might actually be much more well set up to answer this question than I am.
I can't speak for the landscape of higher education for all the types of universities that are out there. I can only speak for SMU, and that is not something we've ever even flirted with as a model. No.
Yeah.
We have time for one more if we answer it very quickly. Okay. Is it a quick question?
I'll make it. I'll make
the last
it fast.
question. Just want to say.
This is loud.
Okay,
Sorry. Kind of on the other end of the timeline, and talking with this postmortem analogy. Do you have any data, or is there any best practices or effective practices for if and when a student leaves, when they are already at the door? How do you capture the data? Who is the best person at the exit door to talk to them? Is it an academic advisor? Is it a student affairs practitioner? How do you find out, oh, you only owe $650. We can help you. Or, oh, the campus climate here isn't a place where you feel safe. How do you capture as they're walking out? Do you do exit interviews? Do those work? Is it too late by the time someone's at the door? What is the best way to capture the last moment someone
We try and catch them before they're out the door, obviously, because we want them to stay. So we have a variety of mechanisms in place. For example, the faculty are, as part of faculty orientation, faculty training, and as part of communication to department chairs, they're told regularly if a student comes to you to ask, for example, for a letter of recommendation because they're going to transfer somewhere else, let Tony Tillman know. He's our assistant provost in charge of retention. Tony will reach out. The registrar's office, when students request transcripts, those requests are forwarded as well to Tony so that he knows when students are requesting transcripts so he can watch for transcript patterns and reach out to those students. And he tries to, if a student is going to leave the university, have an individual interview with them to better understand the logic behind their reason. If we don't catch them before they go, we do follow the National Student Clearinghouse to find out where they went. So that we can try and get a sense of why they might have made that move. But because he's not an academic advisor, he's not a faculty member, he has resources and connections across campus, so he can work with our bursar's office to find out if it's a financial issue, how much is the hold. He can work with our financial aid office. Is there financial aid available to fix that financial problem? He can reach into a variety of offices on campus. So I would say that's where you need sort of the broad, high-level administrative support for someone who has an overarching responsibility for this. That's been our experience, at least.
I was going to say, what I've seen actually in these instances is literally they get on the phone and they call them. Mm-hmm. And that often comes stimulated from somewhere in the provost's office, but not always. And that's sort of twofold. It's sort of to find out why they left. But also, I mean, as you mentioned, there are a lot of universities now trying to do, whatever your last mile programs, but trying to recruit them back. Finish what they started. They've already got this many credits, and so that literally, the old-fashioned way, they pick up the phone.
What's fascinating about this recruit back programs is they often turn up students who graduated and they didn't know.
Yeah, that's true.
They just never got their diploma. They had all the credits they needed. The exit phenomenon, the exit survey, or what can I do on the way out the door? It's real hard. A lot of students don't show up for those sort of things, and very few leave forwarding addresses. so even finding them can be difficult. So the data's pretty spotty. If you guys are able to do that in some kind of comprehensive way, like that's fantastic.
Well, that's because we try and catch them when they order the transcripts.
Yeah. Right.
Someone orders 3 transcripts to 3 different schools on a random day in the spring, they're getting a phone call.
Yeah, that means they're making a move.
And actually, the people who graduated and didn't know it are happening everywhere. Now, I just talked to National Student Clearinghouse, who are at a big reverse transfer is like the incredibly boring name for it. They really need to rebrand it. But I would ask what's going on if universities where you are trying to like mail diplomas or transcripts or get people to at least call them back because, hey, actually you earned a college degree and you didn't know it.
To go completely far afield over this, an issue that, and since you guys are interested in covering the industry, an issue that I think, me personally, will become a much bigger issue over the next couple of years is this issue of credit articulation and transfer. Students are big bags of credits. Your average Cal State student has credits from 5 institutions, including high school AP credits, something they did online, something from community college, whatever. Not all of it adds up. It's not easy to do, and the articulation process is really kind of messed up, actually. So students are losing a lot of credit for their credits as they go, and that means that they're losing money. So it's a growing issue. It's one that we're only beginning to pay more attention to now that transfers are becoming such a big deal. I think it's going to be on your radar.
Here, I'll add another element to that is that a lot of universities doing the graduate in 4. Sorry,
We have so much to talk about, you guys.
sorry. How do you actually do a graduate in 4 on a 2+2?
Oh, yeah.
That's going to be an interesting. Yeah.
Well, we're way off topic now, so but no, thank you all so much. This was a wonderful discussion, and thank you for joining me.